All right, welcome to the Generation Lyme podcast. My name is Jesse Ruben. I am joined by fellow board members Brooke Stoddard and Jennifer Hoffmann. Hello, how are you guys doing?
Good. How are you, Jesse?
Hello.
I am good. It is good to see you both. Generation Lyme is an organization devoted to helping anyone impacted by Lyme disease. We have meetups, we have our podcast, we've got a ton of great information on our website, genlyme.org. You can check that out. We just put up recently a bunch of resources for supporters. So if you have someone in your life who is asking you questions and you don't want to have the burden of trying to give them all the information, you can just send them to our website. We are doing a podcast on last month's monthly topic, not this month's, contrary to what I thought 10 minutes ago. The podcast topic this month is boundaries, which is one that I am excited to get into because I have a lot of thoughts about this. Brooke and Jennifer, I guess we'll just start with you. What is it about boundaries that made you think this would be a good topic? Is there something about this topic that sticks out to you? I think it's personally one that a lot of people have a hard time with, not necessarily just Lyme disease patients, but I do think it is very appropriate to talk about in terms of Lyme disease. So I'm just wondering your initial thoughts on this topic and why you thought it would be important to discuss.
Yes. We do this every time. Little break right here. We're watching on YouTube. You can see us all giggle. This is probably a good time to talk about, I think we covered this in our monthly topic post for boundaries. And sometimes I think it's better. Sometimes I think it's a good idea to go over how we've introduced the topic to the community, like on the podcast, because kind of does explain why we chose it in the first place. And in this case, yes, boundaries are worth talking about with anybody. And there's something that everybody can struggle with, and most people often do. They're big. It's a pretty hot topic if you're in the online, if you're on Instagram, for example, and you follow any influencer of any kind, especially like a therapist or a mental health account, boundaries comes up a lot. So I'll just read part of our monthly topic post.
Great.
Boundaries are personal and important. They help us establish standards for what we accept in our lives. They help us learn to trust ourselves more. Setting them is an act of self-respect and self-love and can be essential to the healing process, but it's rarely easy to do. So many of us struggle with saying no and communicating our limits. That's a normal part of being human. With Lyme disease, this gets even more complicated because we often need to rely on others who may not respect or even know what our boundaries are. So, what are healthy boundaries? When we know that we are only responsible for our own actions and emotions and not those of others. We don't need to carry the burden of other people's expectations. You have unconditional permission to set boundaries wherever and whenever you need them. You also have permission to be in the process of figuring out what all of this means to you.
I love that last part. Also, I feel like that
Yeah.
could just be the pod. We're done now. We just covered everything. That was pretty good.
There's
But
a lot in the easier said than done, though.
yes, I was thinking that as you were reading, I was like, oh, that's really hard. Oh, that's also really hard. Oh, that's also really. It's one thing to say like you're allowed to set boundaries, but actually setting them, I find, can be incredibly challenging.
Mm-hmm. And especially with that little part in there about Lyme and really any illness or disability or just something going on in your life where you need to rely on other people, that can make your boundary really porous or vague. And there are a lot more expectations you might deal with from other people. And boundaries to me are a question of where's the line for you about anything with anyone. And when you start needing to change your relationship with other people and your needs from them and your relationship with, I don't know, the whole world, it can be very hard to establish where the line is especially when you have to move it. And then other people don't know what all of that means unless you can even tell them. If you can't articulate it, then even to yourself, I mean, that's just, it becomes very tricky.
I guess the most helpful thing we could do is really focus on, at least for a little bit, just boundaries in terms of dealing with an illness, especially that like beginning phase where you're still trying to figure it out and you're trying to figure out where the limits are of your health and your energy and your well-being and all those things. Brooke, I'm just wondering if were boundaries a big thing for you when you were first starting to get sick and figure out what was going on with you, or was it something that you just never really thought about?
Yeah. First of all, this is a great topic and sometimes a complex topic to navigate for different constituents of the Lyme community, as Jennifer and you have already discussed. But boundaries apply not just to Lyme patients, but also to Lyme supporters and family members of Lyme patients, and partners and loved ones of Lyme patients. And so when I think of boundaries, because I am personally a Lyme patient, I think of boundaries first and primarily from a patient perspective. And I think what's so complicated about the Lyme disease experience for so many people, including the three of us, is that it can be very long term. And so when I think about boundaries as a patient, boundaries mean creating the time and space for me to do so many things that help me navigate the Lyme experience. I need time and space to experiment with treatment protocols, research Lyme symptoms, go to doctors until I find the right one. I need time and space to herx, to manage symptoms, to detox. And for one thing, being comfortable in my own skin and sort of creating that space for me is hard. And then it's even harder to explain those boundaries to the people in my life who are around me. And those could be family or friends or, coworkers or just other people that I associate with. And so for me, again, boundaries apply to every type of constituent in the Lyme community. But to answer your question, I've thought a lot about the boundaries that I've needed over the past 10 or so years to launch my recovery process. And I've thought a lot about the challenge of explaining those boundaries to the people in my own life.
So you're saying a lot about, I need time for this, I need time for this, I need time for this. When you're taking time to do those things, or when you were taking time to do those things, were you alone? Were you by yourself dealing with that stuff? Did you have like a small inner circle of people that you were very open with and you kept everyone else out? Were you open with everybody? How did that look for you as far as, because I think in this particular way, everyone's different. Some people really want to just be on their own. Some people, for like 2 years, my wife used to joke like that my name was like, "Hi, I have Lyme disease. My name is Jesse." Like, because I told
Mhm.
everybody. So I'm just curious how that looked for you, especially at the beginning.
I think a lot of the time I have been sort of alone in my own thoughts about boundaries, or alone physically in my home, sort of dealing with elements of the Lyme experience, like, herxing or detox, for example, or just doing research on Lyme symptoms. But in terms of engagement or interaction with other people, I would say it depends. And it depends on so many different variables. It depends on my relationship with certain people. So, for example, friends and family would get, all the details of my Lyme experience without any barriers. But strangers would only get to hear a piece of my experience. Or coworkers 10 years ago, when I was really struggling with a sort of pre-diagnosed Lyme, I wasn't telling them every single symptom that I was dealing with. I was telling them a subset of my symptoms, the ones that I thought that they could understand in a short amount of time before they got bored of me talking about my symptoms. And so for me, discussing my Lyme experience as it relates to boundaries, the words that came out of my mouth were different depending on who and which types of people I was interacting with.
What an interesting thing. You're dealing with you're dealing with so many symptoms that you have to categorize them into groups of symptoms that you can share with people casually in your life and people you won't symptoms you won't share with those people. I mean, just what a crazy amount of mental gymnastics we all had to do. Jennifer, what were your thoughts on this stuff when you were, I mean, I know you've been sick for such a long time, so I think it's probably a little different, but in your life as you grew up and were getting older or were making friends and stuff, like did you bring everyone in? Did you have people in different pockets? What did that look like for you?
Definitely people in different pockets. And I brought almost no one into everything. And I had bad experiences when I brought people all the way in, because that was.
Can you be a little more specific? Because I think people listening probably can relate to that.
Yeah, of course. I think, well, yes, I could spend a lot of time talking about how I felt betrayed, or that, and how the information I was used, that I provided about my vulnerabilities and my ill health, especially when I didn't have all of these concrete answers that I have now, was used against me in ways where it was like that, this person, she's faking, or just has a problem with food, or a problem with drugs, or just wants attention, like literally all kinds of stuff, or was used as a reason to abuse a relationship in a certain way, like, oh, her health isn't great, and so I'm not going to treat her with the same level of respect and consideration that I would another person that seems, big quotes, air quotes here, normal. But I don't know that really, I mean, if other people out there, I know they have, which is terrible, have experienced things like that, you're not alone. And this is a big common thing, that many of us in this community are working in our respective ways to stop from happening again. And destigmatizing and providing tools is, I think, a good way of stopping that. So instead of getting into maybe all of those details right here, and we can get into some details, what I'd really like to talk about is how boundaries have helped me get out of that cycle and help me heal.
That was a really lovely way of saying, Jesse, I didn't like the question you asked. Here's the question you should have asked. That was very kind of you. I appreciate that.
No, I think that's not.
I'm just kidding.
Hilarious.
I'm just kidding.
Because I had a really interesting experience with boundaries that I categorized as an interesting experience a couple of years ago, meaning I'd heard this word as it became more popular in our sort of cultural experience. I had heard it a lot, but I didn't.
It feels a little bit like it's a buzzword, like
yes,
self-care.
It is. And yeah. I have a lot, like I had a lot to say about self-care. I have a lot to say about this.
Oh, yeah.
But on a personal level, I can admit now, I realize now that I did not know what it meant. I thought I knew what it meant. People were talking about it, but I did not get it at all. So for a long time, my boundaries were like, Swiss cheese, or they just straight up didn't exist. Or when I would try to assert what I thought were boundaries, it was really an expression of anger and frustration. And that's not boundary setting. That's not what it is. That's just reacting to said cheese or whatever. That's
I really feel seen in this moment right now, Jennifer.
I think it's I think that's a really common experience, and that leads people to.
I'm setting a boundary. I'm taking care of myself.
How dare you?
Yeah, you're just being angry and having feelings, but you're not actually.
Yeah, because you didn't establish a boundary. You didn't establish, and so a big thing that when I finally started learning about what boundaries might really be, which is something that are a tool for you, for yourself, that helps other people, helps you engage with other people and helps other people engage with you, that you establish for yourself and you provide to others as guidelines to exist in the world, not as an expression of anger and frustration, not as a myth, as a way to say you only get me this much, or I'm not going to do this thing for you because you don't deserve it, or something like that. It's more like I can engage with you. So for example, let's say a friend, I'm only going to tell them a certain amount about what I'm dealing with, or hang out with them a certain amount because that's how much energy I have. And it's not because I don't love them or because I'm angry at them, but it's because I can show up and be the best version of myself and a friend with them by doing that. And and setting clear expectations for yourself so that you don't feel disappointed in yourself for coming up to the line and saying, okay, I can't hang out anymore. This is where I go home, and this is where I take my leave and take a rest. And whether they get disappointed or not, where you realize their feelings about me or about the situation are not my business. That's definitely a journey to getting there. But when I even finally absorbed that definition, that started changing everything for me. So who I was letting in and how stopped being about how much I liked them and how transactional things felt, and whether or not it didn't feel as risky anymore. It felt like
Setting up the boundary didn't feel as risky.
Yes, deciding who to let in and how and why didn't feel as risky because I had already established for myself how comfortable and confident I felt each time, regardless of the outcome. I was not reliant on other people to provide a response as much because I had taken care of myself by setting up in advance how much I was willing to offer, regardless of what I got back.
I think I wasn't even thinking about setting boundaries for yourself when we were figuring out what we were going to talk about today. I think that's something certainly that comes up a lot on in the meetups, but also just personally of like, I don't think of taking care of myself as setting a boundary of like, it's setting expectations for who I'm spending time with, how much I'm doing stuff. Because I feel like people are so worried about disappointing people or what other people are going to think. And it's just so interesting to me that, we have these people who are so sick and suffering so much. But what are they concerned about in those moments? It's not taking care of themselves. It's like not disappointing people, not making people mad, not making people feel like they don't like them or something. So I mean, I think that is fascinating. I wasn't even considering that.
Because you already feel like such a disappointment.
Yes.
I mean, you're prone to that. That's the thing, where people in our community are starting from such a difficult place already. That's the baseline where you're like, I already have this fundamental issue. I'm sick. My health isn't good. I might be unreliable.
And they see it as a personal failure as opposed to a thing that happened to them.
And that makes it really easy to try to overcompensate and let people in and just give them what they want, be a people pleaser, so that to try to make up for this health thing, when the health thing is just, it is what it is. There's nothing, but you know what I mean. And
totally.
I think people do know what I mean. We try to make up for something that people that we see as being wrong with us, kind of because it's been just so stigmatized. In another version of this world, it could be okay to have imperfect health, and we could all just move on and not feel like we have to compensate. Right. But a lot of the reason that I think people in our community struggle with boundaries is because, yes, we rely on other people for help a lot of the time, and we must, and that's all right, but it doesn't necessarily feel all right in the moment. And because we've got this sort of mark against us, and people then feel like they're owed information, they're owed time, maybe because they helped you, you should then do what they want in other times. And you just want to be seen as being like a person you want to be loved. Like everybody
Totally.
wants to be appreciated, and that can end up causing some boundary issues.
I mean, I think we could have a whole separate podcast / I feel like we already did one on like ableism and productivity and justifying your existence and all of that kind of stuff, which I think all goes hand in hand with all of what you're saying. I'm wondering, one of the things you said, Jennifer, was like having to learn the definition of a boundary. And I got sick when I was 26 and I thought I knew what boundaries were. And then I look back on that period of my life and I had no idea. And I was doing way more people pleasing than I thought. And I guess just to put that into a concrete example is I haven't spoken to my dad since September. I had a lot of guilt about that and being a bad son, and I'm supposed to, he's my dad and I love him, and he has issues, but whatever. When I look back on like the way that my family treated me when I was really sick, I absolutely should have cut them out. Like it would have made it clear like how serious I was. It would have been certainly taking care of myself. So much of me continuing to have some of these people in my life were out of obligation and guilt. And if it were now, I think I would have handled it much differently, and it would have been easier for me to say like, these relationships are not serving me right now. And I guess I'm just wondering, is there a boundary that you guys wish you had set that would have made your suffering a little bit easier when you look back? I mean, Brooke, honestly, one of the things that I've been wanting to ask you about, which I always want to ask you about when it's relevant, is like, even just coming out and sharing that you didn't, when we first started doing this years ago, you were like, I don't want to have my picture on the internet. I don't want to be like out, as like a someone with Lyme disease. So, and then you changed that. But I'm just wondering, is there a boundary you wish you had set when you were starting out or when you were first getting treatment?
Sure. I was really reflecting a lot on my experience listening to Jennifer speak and to you speak. And it struck me that so you started struggling when you were 26. I got Lyme disease when I was 27. And I think I rationally accepted that I had a health problem and my life was going to change and I needed to handle things differently. The way that I remember that experience back in 2010 is I don't remember feeling a sense of guilt about establishing boundaries such that I might disappoint other people, like my friends and family. But I was disappointed and I felt guilty that I had to create new boundaries for my own potential in a way. And the best way that I can explain it is advice that I got from my mom back then. She was one of my the people who I was the most close to, like knew the most details and supported me the most as I was really having a hard time with Lyme. And she said, Brooke, you just have to get used to being like 80% of your best self now as opposed to 100. And I'm not suggesting that that is perfect advice for everybody, but it was perfect advice for me because I was used to a certain level of optimized health and desire to achieve in different areas of my life. And because of all of the symptoms I was dealing with, I had to dial that back and sort of reduce expectations for how much energy I could devote to career or extracurriculars, or how much I might temporarily or in the short run be able to do or achieve. And that helped me establish a new framework and a reality for appropriate boundaries for me and helped me feel less guilty about underperforming. And it was very me centric. It wasn't about me disappointing my mom or other people in my life. It was me feeling sad that I couldn't just go like full steam ahead to do the things that I wanted in my life until I focused on my health and got better. Now, I also don't want to conflate this with the idea that people with Lyme can't achieve everything, because they can't. And that's, I think, part of our message as an organization. But in that time, in those early years, I had to focus and prioritize on getting better so that I could create new space in the future to continue pursuing goals that were important to me in my life.
I mean, it's that you're describing grief. I mean, it sounds to me like you're grieving, you were like in the process of grieving the life you thought you were going to have versus the one that we're currently experiencing, which makes sense. Because I feel like if somebody had said that to me back then, I just would have gotten mad and yelled at them and run out of the room. So it sounds like you handled it much better than I would have. But it does. It sounds like you had this super high expectation. You're like a super high functioning person, very successful, very smart, work hard. And then all of a sudden your body's like, well, we're not going to do this anymore. And that can be really hard to navigate for sure. Jennifer,
One thing, just
go
to
ahead.
add one thing, because you talked about grief, and this idea comes up often in meetups and in our own individual conversations with Lyme patients. Some people talk about a version of themselves before Lyme disease and during and after.
Totally.
And I think that there's so many ways to think about this. We don't have to go down that path, but it doesn't have to be pre-Lyme disease, the body and the person was perfect, and post-Lyme, it's less so. You can actually look at that transition as being very inspiring and like full of opportunity. So yes, the body changes and we change pre versus during and post-Lyme, but the during and post-Lyme part of the experience can be so fulfilling and in some ways inspiring and create new opportunities for us as humans. And so I just want to, for anyone struggling and thinking that during and post-Lyme is awful, it's just not always like that. It can be really kind of wonderful in its own mysterious way.
Life can be awful even if you're totally healthy.
That too.
Oh, just different. Sorry. Making jokes when I probably shouldn't. Jennifer, you have a very loud face and you have been smiling for quite some time. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on all of this.
Well, I definitely resonate with Brooke with what you just said about needing to, a lot of this, about that experience needing to rethink your potential, and that grief experience, and almost the setting a boundary for yourself on how you're going to approach that whole thing as being pretty critical to healing. And it doesn't need to be that boundary doesn't need to exist forever. I think one thing that is maybe like course level 2 in our boundary
advanced,
class,
intermediate boundary setting.
an intermediate boundary setting might be, and maybe it's advanced, but it might be that your boundaries can change just like your mind can change, but boundaries can be set according to what you do need at the time, at a given time, what the situation calls for. And it might be that in our healing experiences, we need to go, okay, well, this is what I'm working with right now. This is the amount of energy I have right now. So my boundaries on appointment setting or hanging out with people are pretty strict because I just don't have that availability. I don't have that capacity. Additionally, I maybe set some boundaries with myself about like how far down a rabbit hole I might go about my own. It's not feeling my feelings, but about like, is this my new forever? And that how.
Oh, I hated that question.
I
hated that question.
To be honest, I think we all think about it, and I think it can creep back up at any old time, and it creeps back up for me a lot. And so this a bit of a boundary that I've set with myself to at least be able to acknowledge when it comes up that I should step back, that there's a need for me when I get into that to step back. So it's a boundary can even be just a self-reminder, best practices for yourself.
Yeah.
And then just know that you can change your boundaries as long as they're up to you as you need to. I think that it can't be a one and done because people change, circumstances change. And then there's also this is a separate point, but I always think that I agree that the Lyme experience can have good things in it, despite all of the terrible stuff to it. I can't help but mention that it's a lot easier to find the good things in it when you have some access to care.
Yeah.
And that's a huge issue in our community, and maybe off the topic of boundaries, but there are huge boundaries around the care that is available to people in our community. This is more literal sense, but right now we struggle because we're working within a really strong set of boundaries where we don't have insurance coverage, we don't have good testing and treatment options anyway, and the ones that are available are not covered by insurance, and that's something that is a huge barrier to
Huge.
people, not just people getting better, but people having a halfway decent quality of life while they're going through it at all, but to get to some version of another side. And a lot of what we talk about is designed to be really useful to people at any stage, regardless of their level of privilege and access, to navigate their experience and improve quality of life while they're going through it. And if they feel that they've gotten past it, or that they feel it's just going to stay with them forever, because this can be chronic illness, and that's so whatever works for you, whatever stage you're in, hopefully this information is helpful to you. But yeah, I think that's another different type of boundary that we can and should acknowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think institutional barriers for sure play up and have an impact on your quality of life when you're going through something like this. But it's also a really great segue into, I kind of broke up in my head, I broke up the people in my life into like my Lyme people who like actively had Lyme disease and really got it, and then my family and friends, and then like the medical community. And I just want to touch on, I want to make sure that we at least mention, because it's so common. I think a big issue people have, especially when they're first starting out, and I just had an old friend from college contact me because he got diagnosed with a positive Lyme test. So I've been having all these conversations again recently, is with medical people. And I think a big issue we have is like, we are really taught to really trust doctors, like really, these people are heroes. These people are on the front lines, and they are like, I think there are so many incredible medical professionals. However, unfortunately, we're dealing with a situation where it's not that they're cruel or evil or they want people to suffer, but we're dealing with a topic that a lot of medical professionals, a lot of highly trained medical professionals, are either uninformed or misinformed about the reality of Lyme disease. So I just don't want the boundary podcast to go by without mentioning like a really important boundary you can set, especially when you're early on in this process or you're getting treatment, is if a doctor is telling you something that's going on in your body, or gives you a suggestion or a medication or a diagnosis that does not resonate with you, that does not feel helpful, that you feel like, or they're telling you there's nothing wrong, but you really feel like there is, you are allowed to not go back to that doctor. You are allowed to disagree with that doctor. You are allowed to get a second opinion. You do not have to take those medications. You do not have to take steroids. You do not have to, like, all three of us and every person listening to this, I would imagine, have been misdiagnosed multiple times, where if we had actually followed that advice, we would be worse off now than we are, because we stood up for ourselves. So and every time I hear from somebody in my life that either has Lyme or knows somebody who has Lyme, it's always the same story, doctor after doctor after doctor. And so it just feels so important to me to say, like, you are allowed to set boundaries with your medical professionals. You are allowed to set boundaries as far as what you put in your body. You are allowed to set boundaries as far as not taking no for an answer. Like, if there's something, we talk about advocating for yourself all the time, and unfortunately, you really have to do that when you're at your sickest point. So I like, I was like, that was like screaming in my head, like, we have to talk about doctors. We have to talk about doctors. So Glad we got that out of the way.
Glad you mentioned that.
I am so glad that you mentioned that, because that is the key. That is a huge thing. Everyone has dealt with that. My heart was just bursting when you were talking about that, because people don't know that.
Yeah.
And then you get infected with something that the medical community is not aware of, and you're totally screwed. I mean, you potentially you're in the dark about how to navigate it. The people you might see, the system that is set up for you, and all of the steps within that you're supposed to follow are just not currently set up to help people who have tick-borne disease. And that, as you described well, as we all know, is extraordinarily damaging. I think, and there's just, yeah, I mean, and it's such a journey to get there. And
it's so common. Every single
Mhm.
person on our calls, every single person we interact with, every time we put out a prompt of like, what do you want people to know? Every time it's like, what advice do you have? It's always about stuff. It's not always, but very often that comes up of like dealing with medical professionals, because
Mhm.
I mean, I can't speak for anybody else, but I had so many doctors, and it's been 10 years, and I'm still I still get so upset about it, and it's literally been a decade. So many doctors like, good news, you're totally fine. And I was like, what are you talking about? My world is crumbling. I'm dying. Like, I had that conversation. Like, and at first, because I make a lot of jokes. So at first they'd be like, are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure my life is ending. And then it became like 4 alarm fire or whatever. Like, there's a big problem here. And you're telling me there isn't. And so if you're having that experience, if that's your instinct, trust your instinct. If your doctor is telling you good news, you're totally fine, and you are suffering, just find somebody else. Ask
Yeah.
questions. Come to a meetup. Email somebody. Email us. Well, whatever. Sorry, a lot of trauma.
Brooke, you're muted.
You're muted.
Okay, fixed. Gracias. I would add that a lot of us, especially the three of us and most people with Lyme disease, become aware of the flaws in the medical system and the lack of education that most doctors have about Lyme disease. But there are people like the three of us and our organization and many organizations that are so dedicated to giving patients access to resources and information to help them heal faster and less expensively. And I've seen it in the past 10 years, but the information that's available through organizations like Generation Lyme and on the internet is just way better now than it was in 2013.
So much better.
And so my hopes are two things. One, that the medical system will improve to become more patient and access and care based, and sort of better take care of individuals like us who suffer from Lyme disease, but also that we as Lyme patients can help other people just solve their own individual Lyme problems faster and for less money. And so it makes me so happy when someone comes to a meetup and they're struggling with the fact that they finally got an appointment with a doctor, but the doctor's not treating them correctly, or maybe it's an appointment with an LLMD, but the appointment isn't for 3 months and it's outrageously expensive. All I want to do at that point is just say, I'm literally here. Like, what information can I provide you through the three of us and our organization that would help you get a little bit better faster and for less money?
It's like we
We're
found
not
out
doctors,
about.
don't sue us.
Yeah, we're not doctors. This is
We
not
don't
medical
provide
advice.
medical advice because we're not doctors.
Yeah.
But that's my knee-jerk reaction. And I want people listening to know that there are tens of thousands of people who have that perspective, and we're all, for anyone who's frustrated with the flaws in the medical system, there are so many other people who are trying to help them despite those flaws, and we're dedicated to doing that.
In some ways, I feel like we are like, it's like when you discover a band way before they blew up. Like I feel like we got Lyme disease way before
Before
Lyme,
it was cool.
way before it was cool, and like, however many years from now, everyone will know about it. We were just talking about before we started recording, Pfizer and Moderna are taking a Lyme vaccine to trial. Like they're trying, somebody's trying to make some progress here. So hopefully in however many years, none of this will be relevant. Lyme will be very well understood. People will be getting treatment. But Brooke, I mean, I do just want to go before we wrap up. And you mentioned like what you want to say to patients. Um, I was just thinking about like what would I want to say to a Lyme patient about boundaries, and the thing, and then we'll have Jennifer finish because I'm sure she'll say something brilliant and wonderful.
No
Um,
pressure.
no pressure.
Always.
But I think I wish somebody had told me early on that not everyone in your life has to do everything. And what I mean by that is um, my friends and family 10 years ago who don't have Lyme or didn't have Lyme and didn't understand what was happening with me, they could not help me. They could not give me the comfort and advice and support really that I needed. And it wasn't until I connected through my doctor's office and then later with you guys, with a group of Lyme patients, that I really understood what support meant in this arena. And it was really challenging because my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, that was hard for her because she couldn't provide me that support, and she felt like she was lacking something or not being a good enough partner that she could have been, because she couldn't help me. And so I think especially when you're dealing with something like this, it's unrealistic to expect everyone in your life to be able to support you in a way that can be helpful when they truly do not understand what's happening to you. I think that would have really let my family off the hook, instead of being really angry at them for a really long time. And then also, I didn't even know I was doing this, but looking back, when I told people that I had Lyme, or even when I thought I had Lyme, I separated everyone in my life into two categories. One category, which was much smaller, was the people who immediately believed me and were on board. And then the other category was everyone else. And if you were in the everyone else category, I hated you. There were like 5 or 6 people in my life who either had Lyme themselves or knew somebody who had it, who were totally on board and wonderful. And then I was mad at everyone else. And so I just wish that somebody had mentioned to me not to expect that from everybody. Because I think it would have saved me and the people in my life a lot of upset. Jennifer, if you could say something to a Lyme patient, maybe they just got diagnosed or they have their first Lyme literate doctor appointment, and they're asking you about boundaries, what is something that you would like to share with them?
Well, for someone who just got diagnosed, I would say what you said. I would send them here and have them listen.
Send them to this podcast.
Part of the podcast. Yeah, yes, but really that you know your body better than anyone else. You are qualified. You are more qualified than anyone else to assess correctly that something is wrong with you.
And I want that printed out and like put on the wall. Like, you are qualified to know what's happening in your own body.
Yeah.
Period.
I mean, just because someone's wearing a white coat doesn't mean that they magically know every single thing about you. It would, contrary to what we're taught. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're even making the smartest decisions about you in that moment. So be skeptical. That doesn't mean we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and not trust any doctors or take any medication or anything.
We are not anti-medicine. We are not anti-doctor.
But what that means is that we don't have to throw away trusting ourselves either. And we have to remember that critical thinking is important. So just those boundaries around, a lot of the time, doctors we might try may take us down a certain road with medications or even medical procedures like surgeries. And over some of it might work, and then over time we might find, I don't think that this is working for me, and we might report that. And it can get a little tricky because like maybe it worked for a while, or you were really hopeful about it and you like the doctor you're seeing, but it's not really working. And so the boundary comes kind of, it's again, it's with yourself in a sense, where you listen to your gut, know that your body is trying to tell you something. And then if your provider is not taking that into account, or you feel that something is missing, trust yourself and go down that road. I would also tell people who are recently diagnosed to connect with other people, because that really helps. And to what you were saying, Jesse, but I think it kind of follows up with everything we all say all the time, which is that we can provide support, and we can help answer questions, validate questions, and just help give a really important direction. Even if it's not medical advice, it's some really critical experience-led information that helps things move along faster and more comfortably. And just reducing stress is so critical.
Yep.
I think in the meantime, for people who are not necessarily just diagnosed, but who've had this a long time, or this is just a message for anyone, that you're allowed, kind of echoing what we have in the monthly topic post, you're allowed to set boundaries. You're allowed to decide who has access and to what. You're allowed to change your mind about these things. You're allowed to decide how flexible some stuff is. Other people will have opinions, and the world might give you some pressure too. Social media also has some impact on our boundaries, just what we see other people doing and how we feel about that. And we will inevitably disappoint people. So a lot of our work with boundaries involves becoming okay with whatever people might feel. That those feelings are not our business. They're not our fault. And that's a journey to get there, but that's a big part of just detaching from outcomes that can really cause problems. And then finally, this is my hot take on boundaries. Boundaries is a big thing on social media. I think you'll see a lot of memes and like TikToks and posts about like, I set a boundary. You don't owe anyone an explanation about anything. You can just ghost. You can just whatever. I don't agree with that. You don't owe anybody anything in a sense. That's true. But if you would like people to be kind and respectful to you, it might be a good idea to think what's kind and respectful in your own situation. Boundaries are, I think, often used as an excuse to kind of be a jerk these days. Like, this is my boundary. I'm just not gonna.
I'm taking care of
cool.
myself.
Yeah, I'm not gonna, call this person back ever, or tell them why I'm never speaking to them again, or whatever. That's not great. I don't think that's really what it's about. But so that's just something that I tend to think about during the boundaries conversation, because it's so part of the big conversation, the discourse online.
Yeah.
But so just like you can have boundaries and be kind at the same time.
I love that. Brooke, anything you want to wrap up with before we got to get out of here?
So little. What you and Jennifer said was beautiful. The only thing I could think of that was worth adding is that communicating personal boundaries to other people can be hard, and it's iterative, and it's a process, it's a journey. And as a Lyme patient, you might not express or communicate your boundaries in the most eloquent way the first time, but you'll get better at it and more comfortable with it. And I just want to empathize with anyone who has struggled with communicating what a personal boundary is, because it's hard, and that's okay, and that's part of the process, and we're with you along the way.
Yeah. I want to add a tip for that because I feel like tips are
That would
probably
be
good.
great. I'm listening to a tip, by the
Yeah.
way.
Okay. So one would be check out our love languages blog, because Fallon is doing videos on boundaries and love languages, and they're fantastic.
Shout
as
out Fallon.
all of Fallon's materials are. So check that out. The general tips are, you can start small, right? So if you need to communicate a boundary, you can just say, I'm not comfortable with that. And you don't owe someone here's a big thing. You don't owe someone an explanation about why the answer is no. And I think that's a huge barrier to people feeling comfortable with boundary setting, because you want to make them feel better about why you're saying no, but it's just, I'm not available, instead of, oh, I have this thing and maybe this other thing. And that's when people poke holes and pressure you, and you end up saying yes. It's just, I can't come. Or I'd love to be there. Unfortunately, I can't make it. Or I'd love to see you. How about we get together another time? Schedule something else so that you don't feel like maybe I'm disappointing them right now, but I'm showing them that I care, and we'll try something again in the future. Or if it's a more of a personal information type thing and you're not comfortable, I'd rather not is a good way to start. Or I'm not comfortable with that. Or just flat out even saying, like, I get it, but I'm not going to, and letting it sit. And without demonizing people, none of this is like, I hate you or I hate your idea, but thank you for your feedback, or thank you for your suggestion, but I'm not really, that doesn't feel right for me. Something that is short and clear, but there's no reason to give too much info, and there's nothing about that messes with your connection.
I like it.
Those are some tips.
I like it.
Like it too.
All right. Well, on behalf of Jennifer and Brooke, my name is Jesse Ruben. If you have gotten to this part of our podcast, thank you for listening. Please rate and review us 5 stars. It really helps. Just to reiterate, you can get information on our podcast, our meetups, and a ton of great resources on our website at genlyme.org, GENLYME. Guys, as always, great to see you. Thanks for everything. And we'll see you next time. Good job.
Good job to both of you.
You too.
Thank you.